So I'll just say it. The Caribbean is one of the most important regions in world history. Rewind a handful of centuries and Central Asia would be another one. Hitting fast forward, I'd wager that current events in the Pearl River Delta region will have major effects on centuries to come. This is the part of China where the Made in China movement began, for one thing. The experiment that pulled hundreds of millions of Chinese people out of poverty. It's also the location of Hong Kong, which went from being a rocky island to being stolen by the British to becoming a financial capital to being taken back forcefully by China, all in its first 130 years as a city. Things that happened and continue to happen in the Pearl River Delta will change the world forever. Now you may be saying, how is Central Asia as important as that? Look at the region today and you will see a lot of empty land dotted with small governments that, more often than not, are rotted out with corruption. I mean, you may never have given it any thought in the first place. So how could Central Asia possibly be that important? Well, the region was once crisscrossed by a trading network known as the Silk Road that stretches from China to the Middle East. That network, along with its related ocean trade routes, fueled a booming economy that was running a world very different than ours today. This is all a story to be told elsewhere, but I'll give you this fact before moving on. If you've ever wondered why Indonesia is mostly Muslim, it's because Arab traders were hustling spices worldwide that were grown on a secret Indonesian archipelago known as the Spice Islands, and the religion spread from there. Anyway, these days, when you hear the word Caribbean, you probably think of beaches or maybe offshore banks, which is fair really because that's what's on TV and in the headlines. But events here completely changed the world. But as with Central Asia, you'd have a hard time guessing it by the region's reality today. So what happened here? Let's get back to the world of the Silk Road. A little over 600 years ago, while the Islamic world was still in a renaissance, Europe was a poor and very backwards place. War was constant. It basically never stopped happening, which didn't make it a great place to live. Europeans were fighting and colonizing each other since weapons were invented, but that battling lasted a lot longer than you might think. For example, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in 1431. No, there won't be a test later. I just wanted to point out that that was only 61 years before 1492, which is a date you probably know. 1492, of course, is the year that an explorer from Europe, who was on an insane quest to find an alternate route to Asia, happened upon an island in what is now the Bahamas. And you should know the basics of what happened next. The societies then running the Caribbean region, most notably Taino, the Caribs, and the Maya, were pushed aside in the aftermath of the Spanish invasion, and the region was hijacked by Europeans. Spain, England, France, and in a few cases, other European powers began colonizing the Americas. They brought in African forced labor via the transatlantic slave trade, grew crops like sugar on Caribbean plantations, and got very, very rich doing it. It worked like this. Ships in Europe would load up with goods, then sail them south to slave trading kingdoms on the western shores of Africa, where they would switch their cargo for enslaved Africans and take the dangerous and very, very long trip across the Atlantic to the Americas. Finally, after the ships had changed cargo again and loaded up with sugar and other colonial exports, they would enter the Gulf Stream, a sort of river in the sea that took ships from the upper Caribbean back to Europe. Once back on their own continent, these slave ships would sell the goods they picked up at the American plantations. All this was known as the triangular trade. The whole system depended on the forced labor of millions of Africans and their descendants and took place at plantations built on what was once indigenous land. The triangular trade was active for centuries. It happened for a long time. It changed Europe from a barbaric continent into the wealthiest place in the world. Money that the triangular trade brought in funded European empire building. It funded European arts and technological innovation. And it's why, in any country containing European descended people, the upper class is largely white. The end result of the triangular trade was the European-dominated world we still live in 2021, which, as I talked about, is nothing like the world that existed previously. It's worth remembering that, in the same sense, the Earth of the future will hardly resemble this one. Maybe not in your life, maybe not in your grandchildren's lives, but things will reshuffle eventually. That's just how history works. I need to add that, even though a lot of the native population in the Caribbean was wiped out by old world diseases, leaving its nations with a major disadvantage in large-scale combat, the Americas were not easy to colonize, and resistance to the Europeans was heavy. In fact, there were 2 major wars in the Caribbean that you probably haven't heard of. For one, even though the Maya were in a pretty bad state before European arrival, and then got hit by disease, Mayan armies were able to defend their kingdoms from the Spanish for 172 years before surrender. And that's while Spain was getting rich off the triangular trade. That's a long time. But that number is dwarfed by the war that Spain and later the United States fought against the Seminole. That one lasted for a much longer 318 years. The Seminole were a hybrid tribe made up of Creek, Muskogee, and other indigenous warriors that had retreated to Florida after battles elsewhere in the South. During the war, they were joined by a number of escaped slaves who fought alongside them and were also considered Seminole. This conflict was drawn out for so long partly because of the terrain. The Seminole would utilize Florida's swamps to evade and ambush the Europeans, a way of fighting that would later become known as guerrilla warfare. However, while it was home to wars that would change the course of history and was the location of the economic engine that built today's global order, the Caribbean is no longer close to being the center of the world. It's pretty hard to imagine a time when the French, given the chance to choose between Grenada, a tiny Caribbean archipelago, and Quebec, the massive territory that makes up a huge amount of Canada today, almost chose Grenada. That decision would be a no-brainer today, but the Caribbean was once so important that that did happen, and that's something everyone should know. This has been an Other Map video. Be sure to like and subscribe for more alternate history content. Our first season focuses on the Caribbean, so if you thought this was interesting, check out that playlist. Peace out.